Hi, I'm Rebecca from the blog and YouTube channel Moon and Magnolia. Recently, a viewer asked in the comments, what is the difference between inactive sourdough starter and sourdough starter discard? So I want to clear up some of that confusion for all of you because I feel like if one person has that question, a lot of people have that question. One of the most confusing parts for many bakers is what in the world is sourdough starter discard? Discard is what you remove from the jar before feeding your starter. But here's where things get a little tricky. Discard can be active or inactive starter. So before we even get into what is sourdough starter discard, let's figure out what is active versus inactive sourdough starter. Active sourdough starter is a starter that has been fed within 4 to 12 hours and is beginning to double in size. This is my sourdough starter that I fed a few hours ago, and you can see that it is bubbly and light and airy in texture. When I fed it, it was about down here, so it is about doubled in size. It probably has a little bit more to go. But these bubbles indicate that this is an active starter. Active sourdough starter is truly active. It is where the bacteria and yeast are metabolizing the micronutrients in the wheat. So that means that there's true action happening, and those bubbles are actually part of the digestive process, which is a little bit weird, by the way, of the bacteria and yeast in your starter. So an active sourdough starter contains the most amount of yeast and bacteria that you need for baking sourdough bread. I've mentioned on YouTube a lot that it's important to have a visual understanding of what your starter looks like at its various stages, so that way you can look at it and know exactly what is going on. So an active sourdough starter is bubbly, it's light, and it is increasing in size. Most of the time that means it is doubling in size. It has probably been fed within the last 4 to 12 hours, and how fast it becomes active really depends on the environmental conditions, the temperature of your home, how strong your starter is, what you're feeding it, and other factors. But for most of us, it's usually somewhere in like the 6 to 8 hour range, but it can go anywhere from 4 to 12 hours. Now, the reason why a lot of recipes call for active starter is because it does contain the most amount of yeast and bacteria, which means the bulk fermentation will be faster when you are making bread. I have a full YouTube video that shows the difference between baking with active and inactive starter. I'll link that in the description box below. But the thing with active sourdough starter is that it just works faster because there's more bacteria and yeast. Inactive sourdough starter is the exact opposite. It is starter that has not been fed and that does not contain the most amount of yeast and bacteria. So this is my inactive sourdough starter, and you can see there are no bubbles and it's really flat. And that is because it has already undergone the entire metabolic process, and now everything has deflated and it is no longer digesting the micronutrients in the wheat. So in other words, an inactive starter is an unfed starter. So once you feed your starter, it gets light and airy and bubbly and it doubles in size, and then those bubbles begin to pop and it begins to deflate. Once it starts to reduce in size and the bubbles start to pop, it's basically an inactive starter at that point. So you can see here the active sourdough starter is really bubbly and light, and the inactive starter is flat and almost a little bit watery. So let's talk about sourdough starter discard. And here's where things get a little bit tricky. Discard can often be active or inactive starter. It's simply starter that you're taking out of your jar and putting elsewhere. Now, a lot of sourdough discard recipes mention you can use inactive starter, and that's often because people have a little stash of inactive starter in their fridge or a little bit extra in their jar that they want to use up before feeding their starter. So sure, a lot of times sourdough discard recipes do mention using inactive starter, but almost 100% of the time you can use active sourdough starter for discard recipes too. So sometimes what I do is I feed my starter, I let it get bubbly and active, and then I pull some out for a sourdough discard recipe. What remains in the jar is just starter that I'll use for bread later, or I'll just stick the whole jar in the fridge and feed it again next week. What I have taken out is discard. So it can be a little bit confusing sometimes because I think we equate inactive starter with discard, but actually discard can be either or because it is simply just what you take out of the jar. Now, most of the time people are taking their discard out of the jar before they feed it, but don't let the language trip you up. If you have a jar of active sourdough starter and you're like, I'm gonna make these discard brownies right now, do it. If you were using active sourdough starter for a discard recipe, the one thing I would mention is that either make sure you're weighing your starter so that way you're getting the proper amount for the recipe, or when you have the discard, just make sure you stir the bubbles out before you measure it in cups, because those bubbles take up space. So if you're pouring a light and bubbly starter into a measuring cup, you might not actually be getting the right amount of starter for a discard recipe. But other than that, you can use active sourdough starter in the same way you would use inactive sourdough starter for discard. When you're starting a sourdough journey, it can feel a little overwhelming sometimes, especially because there's a lot of language involved that you might not be familiar with. Active starter, inactive starter, discard, cold proof, bulk fermentation, all of these things. But in time, I promise you, you will know what all of them are. So don't let yourself get hung up on the language, because most of the time it will work either way. I have a number of YouTube videos that cover making your own sourdough starter and answering some of the most common sourdough starter questions, so I will link those in the description box below. But if you don't have a sourdough starter yet and you really want to make one and you're not sure where to start, check out the description box for the link for my free simple guide to making and using sourdough starter. It's a 30+ page ebook that will walk you through step-by-step of making your own sourdough starter, making your first loaf of sourdough bread, answering tons of questions, and it also has some sourdough discard recipes. It's totally free, and you can get that in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and I will see you again next time.